Ladies and gentlemen, my introductory remarks are going to be organized around three main challenges facing European labour markets. The first is how to overcome the legacy of high and persistent unemployment in the aftermath of the Great Recession and the Eurozone crisis. The second challenge is how to cope with aging populations and workforces. And the last challenge I want to touch on is the existence of a wide range of skill gaps which bedevil our economies. So let me turn first to the recovery from the Great Recession and the Eurozone crisis. It's well known that European labour markets have suffered badly in the aftermath of the Great Recession and the crises that have hit hard some members of the Eurozone. The European Union 28 average unemployment rate rose from 7.1% in 2007 to a peak of almost 11% in the second quarter of 2013. Since then, there has been a slow improvement in the labour market in line with the ongoing economic recovery. The latest Eurostat data for April of this year show that the EU 28 average unemployment rate had dropped back to a seasonally adjusted 9.7%. At the same time, it's important to bear in mind that there's a very wide disparity in unemployment rates across the European Union. The lowest unemployment rate in April of this year was recorded in Germany, 4.7%, followed by the United Kingdom with 5.4%. Both of those rates, by the way, being below the current rate in the United States. At the other extreme, the highest rates were recorded in Spain, 22.7%, and Greece, 25.4%. And it's no surprise that some of the highest rates are to be found in those European countries most affected by the Eurozone crisis. However, even in those countries there are improvements, notably in my own country, Ireland, Portugal, and more recently in Spain and Italy. Greece, however, remains mired in recession with all the continuing uncertainty over its ability to remain in the Eurozone. As the slow recovery in the European economy is projected to continue over the next 2 years, unemployment will continue to drop in most of the countries. But I would say there are two areas of real concern about European labour markets in the recovery. The first is how to make rapid inroads into high and persistent long-term unemployment. Long-term unemployment being defined by the OECD as those people who have been out of work for over a year. And the second is the issue of high youth unemployment. So let me now just say a few words about both of those concerns. Over 4 out of every 10 unemployed persons in the EU has been out of work for over a year, and the share has increased somewhat since the Great Recession. In a few countries, the long-term unemployed actually account for over 60% of total unemployment. And it's clear that long-term unemployment on such a large scale implies very high social and economic costs and puts major burdens on the public finances. Now, while the recovery will help cut the ranks of the long-term unemployed, it also needs to be complemented by effective activation strategies designed to assist the long-term unemployed to find work. Across Europe, you can see examples of countries that have effective activation strategies for the long-term unemployed. Here I would cite Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, the United Kingdom. While other countries lack such strategies, these would include France, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Portugal, or have only just begun to implement them, which is the case in my own country. With regard to the youth labour market, there is much political concern about the threat of a lost generation. The average youth unemployment rate in the EU 28 in April of this year was 20.7%, with rates as high as 40 to 50% recorded in Greece, Spain, and Italy. However, it's important to have some perspective on such high rates of youth unemployment. They reflect mainly the impact of the Great Recession and the cyclical sensitivity of the youth labour market rather than other factors. Indeed, I often feel a little ironic when I hear politicians talk about the danger of the lost generation and refer to these rates. They forget that there's nothing new about such high levels of youth unemployment. Similar rates were recorded in the early 1980s and early 1990s, and they came down rapidly when economic recovery took hold. Now, I don't see much sign yet of a major technological unemployment shock in these data. The sole partial exception, perhaps, concerns the relatively high unemployment rates of low-skilled workers. But again, this is not a new phenomenon. Empirical studies by the OECD and many academics have shown that skill-biased technical change linked to the ICT revolution, combined with globalization, the rise of China as a major exporter, have worsened the job prospects of low-skilled workers and some middle-skilled workers as well, and have contributed to growing earnings and income inequality. Let me now turn to the issue of population aging. Indeed, rather than worrying in a sense about technological unemployment on an unprecedented scale, my concern really is that we're ignoring another phenomenon which is real and is going to loom much larger over the coming decades, and that is population and workforce aging. Who in this room, for example, knows that Finland is currently experiencing the most rapid population aging in Europe, that Germany is hot on its heels, and that China will shortly experience a dramatic aging process for which it's ill-prepared? Population aging will have huge impacts on labor markets. And on this front, there's some good and some bad news. So let's begin with the good news, put everybody in good form. Relatively little attention, I would say, has been paid to the fact that virtually all European countries, without exception, have experienced rising employment rates among older workers, aged 55 and over, since the late 1990s, reversing the long-standing trend to early retirement which characterized the previous decades. Let me just give you two examples. In Germany, the employment rate of older workers last year was almost 30 percentage points higher than its level in 2000. Even in France, where everybody knows that early retirement is something the French love, and the current retirement age of 62 is one of the lowest in the European Union, the older worker employment rate last year was over 17 percentage points higher than in 2000. And the good news continues, since the trend to increasing employment among older workers has not been interrupted by the Great Recession. The rising trend to employment of older workers reflects several drivers. First of all, the rising educational attainments of the more recent cohorts of older workers, the phasing out of early retirement schemes in most countries, and lastly, reforms to pension systems designed to encouraging workers to work longer. These drivers seem set to persist. Witness, for example, the trend towards increasing the statutory retirement age from 65 to 67, 68, and even towards 70. And some countries who are linking the statutory retirement age to rising life expectancy. So that's the good news. What about the bad news? Well, the trend increase in older worker employment rates that I've just described is driven entirely by older workers remaining longer with their firms. Hiring rates for older workers remain absolutely low. The EU average hiring rate for workers aged 55 and over was only 5% in 2012, and there has been no increase in hiring rates of older workers in recent years. So, the conclusion seems to be that age discrimination is alive and well in hiring, despite the fact that it's banned by legislation in many countries. And one factor behind this is clearly seniority wage profiles. Another is the actual or perceived skill gaps among older workers, skill productivity gap among older workers. So let me now turn, for my last concern, to the evidence on skills. And I want to draw upon evidence for this from the recent and pioneering OECD survey of adult skills, which I suspect many of you will not know about. This survey was conducted in 2011, 2012 in 22 OECD countries and is currently being completed in another 6. Large representative samples of adults aged 16 to 64 were surveyed in all countries, and the database consists of over 200,000 respondents. The survey measured the literacy, numeracy, and ICT literacy skills of the representative sample of adults, and it also collected a very rich set of background information on the respondents' educational and labor market outcomes and how their skills are being used in the workplace. The survey is incredibly rich, and researchers are only just beginning to mine it. And I can only highlight a few of the findings which are emerging, which I think are germane to our discussions. The first one I want to paraphrase the biblical saying is that, like the poor, the unskilled are always with us. The size of the low-skilled adult population is significant in all of the countries surveyed, and in some of them, alarmingly so. The fact that large numbers of working-age adults in many OECD countries have such low skill levels must be a real concern. And in particular, it's worrying that there are large pools of young people with low skills in some countries. I would say these youth are the real lost generation, and assisting them to acquire more and more relevant skills must be a priority. The second fact I want to highlight from the survey's result is that ICT literacy skills are scarce, especially at the highest proficiency level. And it's really striking that the proportion of working-age adults with the highest levels of ICT literacy skills are so low. In no country did this share exceed 10% of the adult population. Not surprisingly, of course, young adults outperform their older peers on ICT literacy skills, but even among them, 1 in every 3 young people could only perform at the lowest skill level. So again, I think this is a major concern. Thirdly, for us oldies, the skill story is really worrying. It appears that skill proficiency in literacy, numeracy, and ICT skills, as measured in the survey, peaks around the age of 30 in almost all countries and then declines steadily at older ages. Now, it's extremely hard to motivate older workers and their employers to invest more in their skills. And the lesson I draw from this is actually that it's much more vital to invest more in upgrading skills during the mid-career year levels. Most of you and I got most of our skills investment before the age of 30. What is key is actually to invest more in the critical mid-career years of 30 to 50, 55. Lastly, I just want to say low-skilled workers lose out on all fronts, according to this survey. Not only do they lose out in terms of access to employment and jobs with good career prospects, they also lose out heavily in terms of participation rates in further education and training or in on-the-job training. Employers in all OECD countries invest much more in training their high-skilled workers than in their low-skilled workers. And this tendency, of course, clearly exacerbates any technological unemployment. So my final thought is that developing incentives that enable both low-skilled workers and their employers to invest more in their skills must be a high priority. But I can tell you this is no mean task. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.